everyone, welcome to Lies, the part of Extra History where I get to share all the stories that didn't make it into the episodes, correct all the places where we were wrong, and flesh out all the things I wish we had had more time to dive into in the episodes proper. We've got to start with sources. All told, I think I was able to get my hands on 4 books that were biographies of Yi in English. And one of them was an oversized pamphlet printed by the South Korean Tourism Board. And it's not like I'm just going to Amazon for these things. One of the large local universities in my neighborhood has been kind enough to help me find rare and out-of-print sources. But of all these books, the one that's actually most critical of Admiral Yi is this book, which you can see I got from Half Price Books. It's exciting. But yeah, it's called The War Diary of Admiral Yi. And that title isn't some poetic rendering. This is actually his real diary entries. So yeah, the most critical book about Yi I could find was written by the man himself. And that says something. I was reading it and all of a sudden I had this revelation that this man's life has been turned into a Confucian parable. And many of you may have noticed how odd the flow was in the first episode. How it just seemed like over and over I was saying, highly competent Yi was great, but he was betrayed by jealous officials. He bore this betrayal stoically and stayed loyal to the king. And that's because that's exactly how all these books read. And I wanted to give you a sense of all of it so I could talk about it here. Because while all the events laid out are attested to enough for me to believe them to be true, especially when the war actually starts, the way they're presented, especially in his early life, was clearly sort of set up to reinforce a worldview. And I'm not even sure if it's deliberate. I mean, almost everyone writing history in Korea around that period would be a member of the Confucian court, and so they would have it drilled into them, this idea, this way of seeing the world. And it's not overt, it's not moralizing, it's just how they tell the story. And it really made me think, because it's so easy for me to see it when it's being done in a worldview that's so far from my own. It made me think about all the places where I must have missed it from historians who are much more a part of the tradition that I'm used to. I mean, how often do we see Valley Forge presented as Americans don't give up, rather than here's the culmination of a series of blunders that nearly cost the US the war? And the truth is, that's not a lie, right? These events are that parable, right? Washington holding the army together through Valley Forge is one of those incredible stories about Americans not giving up. It's stoic, it's fantastic, so we almost can't help render it through the lens of our culture. But it was just awesome, this sort of awesome shock to see that process in action from outside it. And it was something that I really wanted to point out as we went through this series. But all right, I just had to talk about how interesting it was to have such a perfect example about understanding one's own history from inside one's culture. But now on to Yi, I promise. First things first, I kind of have to talk about how remarkable he was, right? I love Admiral Nelson. I hope we get to do a series on him as part of covering the Napoleonic Wars, and he absolutely deserves to be called one of the greatest admirals of all time. After all, he reinvented how naval combat was done and changed the course of history. But so did Yi. And Yi won 23 out of 23 battles. Nelson won roughly 8 out of 13 battles, depending on how you're counting. And Yi did it with no naval training. The Battle of Okpo was his first time fighting, much less commanding at sea. And even the famous Japanese Admiral Togo said, "It may be proper to compare me with Nelson, but not with Korea's Yi Sun-shin, for he has no equal." And that's always what, as I was doing this, surprised me. It's amazing how little we hear about this guy in the West, just because his story is so good. You figure someone would have picked up the rights to this and made a movie out of it. But anyway, enough. On to awesome Yi minutia. Remember in the first episode where Yi is working at the military academy? And God, I love this story. It's so much the perfect Confucian parable. It's fantastic. So when Yi is at the academy, The first time he gets into a fight with a corrupt official, it's because there's a tree on the academy grounds that this higher up official likes. And so he figures he'll just take it. But Yi stops him, basically saying, this tree is on academy grounds, so it's government property and thus belongs to the king. Therefore, it would be wrong to take it. And so Yi risks his career, and as we see later, his liberty and possibly his life, to make sure to protect a tree. But on to episode 2. Where we start getting out of the parable because Yi's first-hand account sort of kicks in here, and we have a lot more people writing about the war as it occurs in a way that they just weren't about Yi's early life. Because, after all, who thought this stick in the mud would ever amount to anything? So first off, we gotta talk about the diplomacy between Korea and Japan, because this is amazing. So the diplomacy that kicked this whole thing off is total madness. You see, Hideyoshi sent a guy whose family did a ton of business in Korea to be his emissary, which makes sense, right? Guy knows Korea, he knows the people to talk to. But Hideyoshi's demands are totally insane. So Guy takes one look at this message and he's just like, nope. Because he knows that if he presents it to the Koreans, if they don't just kill him, they're certainly going to take away all of his family's trading privileges. But he also knows that Hideyoshi isn't the most magnanimous guy, and if he tells him that his demands are insane, he's probably going to get his head chopped off. So what does he do? Well, the sensible thing, obviously. On the boat ride over, he rewrites the message. So now it's not all, roll over, ye Confucian dogs. It's much more, let's work out how our two nations can work together. So the Koreans send ambassadors back to figure out terms with this new unified Japan. But nobody tells Hideyoshi that's what they're there to do. So they show up, present him with a few gifts, and figure negotiations are going to start. But Hideyoshi thinks they're there to give him tribute. So he accepts their gifts, gets drunk with them, and then never sees them again. So they're just sitting there in his palace, completely unable to get a meeting with Hideyoshi, as he thinks he's done with them, and why should he have to waste his time with them as these are new vassals of his, and shouldn't he just be waiting till they bring him the next round of tribute? Of course, nobody tells the Korean ambassadors that's what's going on either. So they're sitting there getting more and more steamed, and eventually they just pack up and head back to Korea and tell everyone how rude the Japanese is. And they tell everyone that Hideyoshi's baby peed on him during the meeting, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, this happens basically 100% of the time. People alter or simply don't communicate pretty much every message between King Shanjo and Hideyoshi. That every single one they try and send each other, somebody's rewriting. Which is both the reason this war happened in the first place, and the reason that it took them like a half decade for everybody to realize that they were actually going to war. But once they figured it out, all of those strengths and weaknesses we talked about in episode 2 become starkly clear. Remember Yi Il, the man who brought Admiral Yi up on charges in episode 1? Well, he was the guy who basically does the massive wave of losing that Korea gets in at the outset of the war. He was the guy in charge of the land forces for Korea when they got rolled back to Seoul in a month. So the corruption, the fact that Korea is left with an undisciplined army and incompetent leadership immediately shows on land, as does the veteran nature of the Japanese forces and their adoption of firearm technology. But on the sea, it's almost the reverse. And Yi's genius is that he sees this. The Japanese don't have much experience fighting at sea because they've been locked into civil war, which means that if he can just train his troops, he'll have comparable or perhaps even superior forces. Also, and this is the real kicker, Yi recognizes that with his superior naval cannon, he can outrange the Japanese, which fundamentally changes how naval warfare is done. Up to this point, naval warfare in Asia has been about boarding. It's basically a land battle that happens to take place on ships. And that's what the Japanese come prepared for. But Yi makes it about cannons, about sinking ships. And this is why Yi gets away time and time again with almost no casualties. His ships have more cannon on them, they have better range, and he studies the waters to make sure they can also outmaneuver the Japanese. Additionally, his ships are made of more solid wood, And so they're better able to take cannon shots from the Japanese ships, further tipping the odds in his favor. And he's inventing this new type of naval warfare as he goes, which brings me to turtle ships. The language got changed a bit as we were editing the scripts to make it sound more like he invented them whole cloth than he did. There's a historical record of something called a turtle ship existing earlier than this period, but completely disappearing from the Korean Navy. The turtle ship that Yi and his officers designed and commissioned is almost certainly radically different than the older model. But it's not unlikely that they took some of the fundamentals, like having a covered deck, from that original inspiration. Oh, and I think I've mentioned it, but before this, Yi never commanded a naval battle, right? So you know how in episode 3 he's poring over charts? That's because he knows nothing about the waters around Korea. All that crazy stuff he does with positioning and currents later on, he taught himself that as the war was going on. And I should really talk about the war from the other side for a moment, because remember how in the Sengoku Jidai episodes, Tokugawa and his clan just don't go to Korea? Well, that's a big part of why when Hideyoshi dies, Tokugawa is able to sweep aside Hideyoshi's dynasty and bring about a lasting peace. Basically, every other major clan, especially the allies of Hideyoshi, are completely exhausted by the war in Korea. Meanwhile, Tokugawa has been able to use all this time to consolidate his gains from the rest of the Sengoku period, to rest and drill his troops, and to build up his war chest. If Korea hadn't happened, Tokugawa probably would have met a lot more resistance, but because of this adventure, after Sekigahara, everybody's just worn out and gives in. Oh, and in episode 4, when Korea and Japan hit a stalemate and try and work out peace, well, basically the same thing happens as happened at the start of the war. Just like earlier negotiations, essentially none of the messengers deliver any of the messages they're actually given. Instead, they rewrite them along the way, to the point where, for a while there, both sides think the other has surrendered. L to diplomacy. But on a totally different note, something that I hope I did right in this, but I'm not entirely sure, some of the sources I used listed dates in the modern Gregorian calendar, and others used the traditional calendar. Where they were using the traditional system, I always tried to remember to convert it to Gregorian to keep everything consistent and give everybody watching a better sense of what season it was when things were happening, as that's actually pretty important for some of the naval decisions. But don't trust me 100%. I'm like 95% sure I got all of them, but the two systems are out of sync only by a handful of weeks, so you might want to double check. Back to matters at hand, let's talk about episode 5, when Hideyoshi dies. Remember how everybody's like, let's leave Korea? Well, theoretically somebody found Hideyoshi's will when they were having that discussion, and of course, it commanded them to do just that as his dying wish. But on the list of pretty clear historical fakes to provide someone with political cover, that ranks fairly high on my list, which is why I didn't make it into the episode. And when one of the Japanese ships slips through the Korean lines, one of my books said that they actually just asked to be let through as a messenger boat, and the ship who intercepted them just sort of said, seems reasonable, and let them through. It was a really detailed account, so it was detailed enough that it seemed sort of credible, but not enough other sources corroborated it, so I couldn't commit to putting it in, but it is an interesting anecdote, so I figured I'd throw it at you. Additionally, on that line, Yi's son or nephew wearing his armor might also be apocryphal because it was only mentioned in some of my sources, but basically every source I read mentioned that no one, including people on his own ship, realized it wasn't Yi until after the fight, which makes me fairly confident in putting them wearing the armor in, because otherwise, how could people not know? And I wanted to make sure I got to at least a few user questions. Alright, so Krista asks, because Yi started beating the drum, does that mean that the Korean ships had oars as well as sails? And that is a good catch. It is absolutely true. Let's see. Alan asked if the Japanese religion, the commander's religion, had any impact on the war. Insofar as it shaped who they all were, I think it did. But as for its sort of direct result, the only impact I saw was in how the Japanese forces were divided, as in part the army was divided along religious lines. Let's see. Johnny asks what prompted Yi to build the turtle ship, and what made it so impactful. Yi saw before most people did that the war was inevitable, and so he began aggressively trying to modernize the fleet. And this is speculation on my part, but given how he used it, I think he realized he needed sort of a pinning ship, right? The turtle ship was incredibly effective at ramming. It was totally unboardable because of the top covering, and it just had this devastating fire at short range, which meant he could basically send it crashing into the middle of the enemy fleet to take out their command vessels, to break up their formation, and to sort of pin the fleet down while they tried to deal with the heavily armored ship firing in all directions in the middle of them, which left his other ships to engage optimally at range. Kelly asks what happened to turtle ships after the war. While they continued to see service, this was really their heyday, as Korea didn't participate in many more large-scale naval conflicts until after they were outmoded. So Trevor wants to know what effect the war had on China, and that's a really interesting one. Yi himself was respected as far off as the Chinese court, and when word of his exploits and his death got back to them, there was all sorts of praise for him. But while the war was definitively a short-term victory for the Chinese emperor, demonstrating that China was still the dominant land power in Asia, the cost of the war can be seen as one of the things that would lead to the downfall of the Ming Dynasty and the eventual rise of the Qing. Lastly, many of you in the comments asked what happened to the court officials who blocked Yi throughout all this. And while there was some cleanup on the Korean side, like these things tend to roll out, most of them at least lived through the war. And even Yi Il, who persecuted Yi and nearly lost the war for the Korea, outlived Yi by 3 or 4 years. But on to important stuff. Walpole. George Alexander Ballard, the naval historian and admiral who helped make Yi known in the West, once said of Yi, "It is always difficult for an Englishman to admit that Nelson ever had an equal in his profession. But if any man is entitled to be so regarded, it should be this great naval commander." And now, George Alexander Ballard was a member of the Order of the Bath, which was founded 2 centuries earlier under Walpole. And get this, because it's so perfectly Walpole, it was founded as a political expedient so that way he could trade away the honor of being a member of the Order for political favors. So I'm going to wrap it up, but I want to give a huge thanks to J.J. Jones, who helped us with pronunciation. I also want to mention that we're going to be putting up the Kinder's music in a separate video right after this goes up, because it's awesome, and it's a shame that it only gets heard in the truncated format in our videos. So if you want to listen to Yi's music, to the Yi music in its true form, it'll be here, and these guys are amazing. It really deserves to be listened to. And that reminds me, another extra special thanks to Wong Hong, who played the erhu on the track, something that he also did for the music in Avatar. And just to let everyone know, for production reasons that have to do with not accidentally working artists to death, we do everything in sort of 6-episode blocks. So when one of the main stories runs an episode or 2 short, we'll be filling in with one-offs like the Odin Office episode that let us explore things that might not fill a whole series. And I'll leave you with one more announcement. Next week, we are going to get to talk about the Broad Street Pump, which is the founding point of epidemiology and in many ways a turning point in modern medicine. It's also an awesome detective story, so I'm really excited to do that, and it's just fantastic. Thank you everybody on Patreon, not only for supporting us, but for voting in crazy things like the South Sea Bubble or the Broad Street Pump. I hope you all get as much of a kick out of this story as I do. I guess I'll see you all next week.